This is a reading of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber. Part 1, The Problem. Chapter 1, Religious Affiliation and Social Stratification. A glance at the occupational statistics of any country of mixed religious composition brings to light with remarkable frequency a situation which has several times provoked discussion in the Catholic press and literature, and in Catholic congresses in Germany, namely, the fact that business leaders and owners of capital, as well as the higher grades of skilled labor, and even more the higher technical and commercially trained personnel of modern enterprises, are overwhelmingly Protestant. This is true not only in cases where the difference in religion coincides with one of nationality, and thus the cultural development, as in Eastern Germany between Germans and Poles. The same thing is shown in the figures of religious affiliation almost wherever capitalism, at the time of its great expansion, has had a free hand to alter the social distribution of the population in accordance with its needs, and to determine its occupational structure. The more freedom it has had, the more clearly is the effect shown. It is true that the greater relative participation of Protestants in the ownership of capital, in management, and the upper ranks of labor in great modern industrial and commercial enterprises may in part be explained in terms of its historical circumstances, which extend far back into the past, and in which religious affiliation is not a cause of the economic conditions, but to a certain extent appears to be a result of them. Participation in the above economic functions usually involves some previous ownership of capital and generally the expensive education, often both. These are today largely dependent on the possession of inherited wealth, or at least on a certain degree of material well-being. A number of those sections of the old empire which were most highly developed economically and most favored by natural resources and situation, in particular a majority of the wealthy towns, went over to Protestantism in the 16th century. The results of that circumstance favor the Protestants even today in their struggle for economic existence. There arises thus the historical question: why were the distincts of higher economic development at the same time particularly favorable to a revolution in the Church? The answer is by no means so simple as one might think. The emancipation from economic traditionalism appears, no doubt, to be a factor which would greatly strengthen the tendency to doubt the sanctity of the religious tradition, as of all traditional authorities. But it is necessary to note what has often been forgotten, that the Reformation meant not the elimination of the Church's control over everyday life, but rather the substitution of a new form of control for the previous one. It meant the repudiation of a control which was very lax, at that time scarcely perceptible in practice, and hardly more than formal, in favor of a regulation of the whole of conduct which, penetrating to all departments of private and public life, was infinitely burdensome and earnestly enforced. The rule of the Catholic Church, quote, punishing the heretic but indulgent to the sinner, end quote, as it was in the past, even more than today, is now tolerated by peoples of thoroughly modern economic character, and was borne by the richest and economically most advanced peoples on earth at about the turn of the 15th century. The rule of Calvinism, on the other hand, as it was enforced in the 16th century in Geneva and in Scotland, at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries in large parts of the Netherlands, in the 17th in New England, and for a time in England itself, would be for us the most absolutely unbearable form of ecclesiastical control of the individual which could possibly exist. That was exactly what large numbers of the old commercial aristocracy of those times, in Geneva as well as in Holland and England, felt about it. And what the reformers complained of in those areas of high economic development was not too much supervision of the life on the part of the Church, but too little. Now, how does it happen that at the time those countries which were most advanced economically, and within them the rising bourgeoisie middle class, not only failed to resist this unexampled tyranny of Puritanism, but even developed a heroism in its defense? For bourgeois classes, as such, have seldom before and never since displayed heroism. It was, quote, the last of our heroisms, end quote, as Carlyle, not without reason, has said. But further, and especially important, it may be, as has been claimed, that the greater participation of Protestants in the positions of ownership and management in modern economic life may today be understood, in part at least, simply as a result of the greater material wealth they have inherited. But there are certain other phenomena which cannot be explained in the same way. Thus, to mention only a few facts, there is a great difference discoverable in Baden, in Bavaria, in Hungary, in the type of higher education which Catholic parents, as opposed to Protestant, give their children. That the percentage of Catholics among the students and graduates of higher educational institutions in general lags behind their proportion of total population may, to be sure, be largely explicable in terms of inherited differences of wealth. But among the Catholic graduates themselves, the percentage of those graduating from the institutions preparing in particular for technical studies in industrial and commercial occupations, but in general from those preparing for middle-class business life, lags still farther behind the percentage of Protestants. On the other hand, Catholics prefer the sort of training which the humanistic gymnasium affords, that is, a circumstance to which the above explanation does not apply, but which, on the contrary, is one reason why so few Catholics are engaged in capitalistic enterprise. Even more striking is a fact which partly explains the smaller proportion of Catholics among the skilled laborers and modern industry. It is well known that the factory has taken its skilled labor to a large extent from young men in the handicrafts, but this is much more true of Protestant than of Catholic journeymen. Among journeymen, in other words, the Catholics show a strong propensity to remain in their crafts. That is, they more often become master craftsmen, whereas the Protestants are attracted to a larger extent into the factories in order to fill the upper ranks of skilled labor and administrative positions. The explanation of these cases is undoubtedly that the mental and spiritual peculiarities acquired from the environment, here the type of education favored by the religious atmosphere of the home community and the parental home, have determined the choice of occupation, and through it the professional career. The smaller participation of Catholics in the modern business life of Germany is all the more striking because it runs counter to a tendency which has been observed at all times, including the present. National or religious minorities which are in a position of subordination to a group of rulers who likely, through their voluntary or involuntary exclusion from positions of political influence, to be driven with particular force into economic activity. Their ablest members seek to satisfy the desire for recognition of their abilities in this field. Since there is no opportunity in the service of the state, this has undoubtedly been true of the Poles in Russia and Eastern Prussia, who have without question been undergoing a more rapid economic advance than in Galicia, where they have been in the ascendant. It has in earlier times been true of the Huguenots in France under Louis XIV, the Nonconformists and Quakers in England, and, last but not least, the Jew for 2,000 years. But the Catholics in Germany have shown no striking evidence of such a result of their position. In the past, they have, unlike the Protestants, undergone no particular prominent economic development in the times when they were prosecuted or only tolerated, either in Holland or in England. On the other hand, it is a fact that the Protestants, especially certain branches of the movement to be fully discussed later, both as ruling classes and as ruled, both as majority and as minority, have shown a special tendency to develop economic rationalism, which cannot be observed to the same extent among Catholics, either in one situation or in the other. Thus, the principal explanation of this difference must be sought in the permanent intrinsic character of their religious beliefs, and not only in their temporary external historio-political situations. It will be our task to investigate these religions with a view to finding out what peculiarities they have or have had which might have resulted in the behavior we have described. Our superficial analysis, and on the basis of certain current impressions, one might be tempted to express the difference by saying that the greater otherworldliness of Catholicism, the ascetic character of its highest ideals, must have brought up its adherents to a greater indifference towards the good things of this world, Such an explanation fits the popular tendency in the judgment of both religions. On the Protestant side, it is used as a basis of criticism for those (real or imagined) aesthetic ideals of the Catholic way of life. Why the Catholics answer with the accusation that materialism results from the secularization of all ideals through Protestantism. One recent writer has attempted to formulate the difference of their attitudes towards economic life in the following manner. Quote, "The Catholic is quieter, having less of the acquisitive impulse. He prefers a life of the greatest possible security, even with a smaller income, to a life of risk and excitement, even though it may bring the chance of gaining honor and riches. The Proverbs say, jokingly, inner quote, either eat well or sleep well, end inner quote. In the present case, the Protestant prefers to eat well, the Catholic to sleep undisturbed." End quote. In fact, this desire to eat well may be a correct though incomplete characterization of the motives of many nominal Protestants in Germany at the present time. But things are very different in the past. The English, Dutch, and American Puritans were characterized by the exact opposite of the joy of living, a fact which is indeed, as we shall see, most important for our present study. Moreover, the French Protestants, among others, long retained, and retained to a certain extent up to the present, the characteristics which were impressed upon the Calvinistic churches everywhere, especially under the cross in the time of the religious struggles. Nevertheless, or was it, perhaps, as we shall ask later, precisely on that account, it is well known that these characteristics were one of the most important factors in the industrial and capitalistic development of France, and on the small scale permitted them by their persecution remained so. If we may call this seriousness and the strong predominance of religious interests in the whole conduct of life otherworldliness, then the French Calvinists were and still are at least as otherworldly as, for instance, the North German Catholics, to whom their Catholicism is undoubtedly as vital a matter as religion is to any other people in the world. Both differ from the predominant religious trends in their respective countries in much the same way. The Catholics of France are, in their lower ranks, greatly interested in the enjoyment of life; in the upper ranks, hostile to religion. Similarly, the Protestants of Germany are today absorbed in worldly economic life, and their upper ranks are most indifferent to religion. Hardly anything shows so clearly as this parallel that, with such vague ideas as that of the alleged otherworldliness of Catholicism and the alleged materialistic joy of living of Protestantism, and others like them, nothing can be accomplished for our purpose. In such general terms, the distinction does not even adequately fit the facts of today, and certainly not of the past. If, however, one wishes to make use of it at all, several other observations present themselves at once which, combined with the above remarks, suggest that the supposed conflict between otherworldliness, asceticism, and ecclesiastical piety on the one side, and participation in capitalistic acquisition on the other, might actually turn out to be an intimate relationship. As a matter of fact, it is surely remarkable, to begin with, quite a superficial observation. How large is the number of representatives of the most spiritual forms of Christian piety who have sprung from commercial circles? In particular, very many of the most zealous adherents of pietism are of this origin. It might be explained as a sort of reaction against mammonism on the part of the sensitive natures not adapted to commercial life, and, as in the case of Francis of Assisi, many pietists have themselves interpreted the process of their conversion in these terms. Similarly, the remarkable circumstances that so many of the greatest capitalistic entrepreneurs, down to Cecil Rhodes, have come from clergymen's families, might be explained as a reaction against their aesthetic upbringing. But this form of explanation fails where an extraordinary capitalistic business sense is combined in the same persons and groups with the most intensive forms of a piety which penetrates and dominates their whole lives. Such cases are not isolated, but these traits are characteristic of many of the most important churches and sects in the history of Protestantism. Especially Calvinism, wherever it has appeared, has shown this combination. However little in the time of the expansion of the Reformation it (parentheses) or any other Protestant belief (end parentheses) was bound up with a particular social class, it is characteristic and in a certain sense typical that in French Huguenot churches monks and businessmen (parentheses, merchants, craftsmen) and parentheses, were particularly numerous among the proselytes, especially at the time of the persecution. Even the Spaniards knew that heresy (i.e., the Calvinism of the Dutch) promoted trade, and this coincides with the opinions which Sir William Petty expressed in his discussion of the reasons for the capitalistic development of the Netherlands. Gottheim rightly calls the Calvinistic diaspora the seedbed of capitalistic economy. Even in this case, one might consider the decisive factor to be the superiority of the French and Dutch economic cultures from which these communities sprang, or perhaps the immense influence of exile in the breakdown of traditional relationships. But in France, the situation was, as we know from Colbert's struggles, the same even in the 17th century. Even Austria, not to speak of other countries, directly imported Protestant craftsmen. But not all the Protestant denominations seem to have had equally strong influence in this direction. That of Calvinism, even in Germany, was among the strongest, it seems, and the Reformed faith, more than the others, seems to have promoted the development of the spirit of capitalism in the Wuppertal as well as elsewhere, much more so than Lutheranism, as comparison both in general and in particular instances, especially in the Wuppertal, seems to prove. For Scotland, Buckle, and among English poets, Keats, have emphasized these same relationships. Even more striking, as it is only necessary to mention, is the connection of a religious way of life with the most intensive development of business acumen among these sects whose otherworldliness is as proverbial as their wealth, especially the Quakers and the Mennonites. The part which the former have played in England and North America fell to the latter in Germany and the Netherlands. That in East Prussia Friedrich William I tolerated the Mennonites as indispensable to industry, in spite of their absolute refusal to perform military service, is only one of the numerous well-known cases which illustrates the fact, though, considering the character of that monarch, it is one of the most striking. Finally, that this combination of intense piety with just as strong a development of business acumen was also characteristic of pietists is common knowledge. It is only necessary to think of the Rhine country and of Cauli. In this purely introductory discussion, it is unnecessary to pile up more examples, for these few already show one thing, that the spirit of hard work, of progress, or whatever else it may be called, the awakening of which one is inclined to ascribe to Protestantism, must not be understood, as there is a tendency to do, as joy of living, nor in any other sense as connected with the Enlightenment. The old Protestantism of Luther, Calvin, Knox, Vogt had precious little to do with what today is called progress. To whole aspects of modern life, which the most extreme religionists would not wish to suppress today, it was directly hostile. If any inner relationship between certain expressions of the old Protestant spirit and modern capitalistic culture is to be found, we must attempt to find it, for better or worse, not in its alleged more or less materialistic or at least anti-ascetic joy of living, but in its purely religious characteristics. Montesquieu says, Esprit des Lois, Book 20, Chapter 7, of the English that they, quote, had progressed the farthest of all peoples of the world in three important things, in piety, in commerce, and in freedom, end quote. Is it not possible that their commercial superiority and their adaptation to free political institutions are connected in some way with their record of piety which Montesquieu ascribes to them? A large number of possible relationships, vaguely perceived, occur to us when we put the question in this way. It will now be our task to formulate what occurs to us confusedly as clearly as is possible, considering the inexhaustible diversity to be found in all historical material. But in order to do this, it is necessary to leave behind the vague and general concepts with which we have dealt up to this point, and attempt to penetrate it into the peculiar characteristics of and the differences between those great worlds of religious thought which have existed historically in the various branches of Christianity. Before we can proceed to that, however, a few remarks are necessary. First, on the peculiarities of the phenomenon of which we are seeking a historical explanation, Then concerning the sense in which such an explanation is possible at all within the limits of these investigations.